There is a kind of suffering that doesn't come from failure itself. It comes from knowing what you should be doing and watching yourself not do it. You make plans. You set intentions. You tell yourself this time will be different. And for a while, you mean it. But then the mood changes, the energy drops, the discomfort appears, and suddenly the distance between what you want and what you actually do begins opening again. Not because your goals are impossible, not because you are incapable, but because too much of your life is still being negotiated through feeling. That is where discipline begins to matter. Most people think discipline is harsh, cold, rigid, something joyless. A personality trait for people who are naturally strong-willed. But real discipline is not about becoming hard in a performative way. It is about becoming less divided inside yourself, less dependent on whether you feel inspired, ready, confident, or emotionally aligned before you begin. It is about closing the space between intention and action so that your life is no longer constantly being shaped by mood. Because without discipline, even clear goals start collapsing under ordinary human weakness. You delay what matters. You avoid what is uncomfortable. You choose relief over direction and then wonder why you feel stuck. Not dramatically, quietly, repeatedly. And after a while, the real damage is not only that progress slows, it is that something inside you starts losing trust in your own word. That is why discipline is deeper than productivity. It changes the relationship you have with yourself. It teaches you that action does not have to wait for motivation, that discomfort does not have to become a stop sign, that the version of you who wants more from life does not have to keep losing to the version who wants ease in the moment. And once that shift begins, everything starts organizing itself differently. Your mind becomes clearer. Your actions become more consistent. Your identity becomes less fragile. This episode is about that kind of discipline. Not discipline as punishment and not discipline as image, but the kind that steadies your life from the inside out. The kind that makes you more trustworthy to yourself, more resistant to weakness, and more capable of building something real over time. Because staying disciplined is not only about getting things done, it is about becoming someone your future can safely depend on. Discipline removes dependence on motivation. One of the quiet traps many people live inside is the belief that they need to feel ready before they act. They wait for the right mood, the right energy, the right moment where everything feels aligned enough to begin. And when that moment doesn't come or doesn't last, action begins to fade again, not because the goal disappeared, but because the internal condition needed to act was never stable to begin with. That is what makes motivation unreliable. It comes and goes without asking you. It rises for reasons you don't fully control, and it disappears just as easily. Sometimes it is there in the morning and gone by the afternoon. Sometimes it appears after a conversation, a video, a moment of clarity, and then quietly fades when discomfort shows up. And if your actions depend on that feeling, then your progress will always be inconsistent, no matter how strong your intentions are. This is where discipline changes the structure completely. Discipline does not wait for motivation. It removes the requirement for it. You begin to act because something matters, not because you feel like acting. You begin to move even when your mood is neutral, your energy is lower than you would prefer, or your mind is offering reasons to delay. And at first this feels unnatural, because you are going against a pattern that has been quietly shaping your behavior for a long time. The pattern of negotiating with your own resistance. That negotiation sounds familiar. I'll do it later. I'm not in the right state right now. I need to feel more focused first. And while each of those thoughts can feel reasonable in the moment, they often lead to the same result. Nothing happens. The action is postponed. The discomfort is avoided. The day moves on, and the intention remains where it started. Discipline interrupts that pattern, not by removing resistance, but by refusing to let resistance decide. You still feel the hesitation, you still notice the lack of motivation, but instead of treating those feelings as instructions, you begin treating them as background, something present, but not in control. And in that shift, something important begins to change. Action becomes more stable than mood. You stop waiting for the perfect internal condition to begin. You start working with whatever condition is there. Some days it will feel easy. Some days it will feel heavy. But the behavior remains consistent enough that progress is no longer tied to how you feel in the moment. That consistency builds something deeper than motivation ever could. It builds reliability. You begin to trust that you will show up, even when it's not convenient, even when it's not exciting, even when the moment feels ordinary and the reward feels distant. That trust is not loud, but it is powerful, because it changes how you see yourself. You are no longer someone who acts only when inspired. You are someone who acts because it matters, and that difference begins affecting everything. Tasks that once felt difficult to start become easier, not because they changed, but because the barrier between intention and action has been reduced. You spend less time thinking about whether you should begin, and more time actually doing what you already decided was important. That reduces mental friction. It frees up energy that was being spent on internal debate. It removes the constant need to convince yourself before every action. And over time, it creates a rhythm where movement feels more natural than hesitation. There is also something else that begins to happen. Motivation starts following action instead of being required before it. You notice that once you begin, your energy often improves. Your focus sharpens. The resistance you felt at the beginning loses some of its weight. What once felt like something you had to force yourself into becomes something you can stay with more easily. That is not because discipline creates motivation directly, it creates momentum. And momentum makes motivation less necessary. So maybe the shift here is simpler than it sounds. Instead of asking whether you feel ready, you begin asking whether it matters. Instead of waiting for the right state, you begin working from the state you are already in. Instead of negotiating with resistance, you begin moving through it. Because the more your life depends on motivation, the more unstable it becomes. And the more it depends on discipline, the more consistent it becomes. And consistency, over time, is what turns effort into something real. You build consistency that compounds over time. One of the most misleading things about growth is how invisible it often feels in the beginning. You do the work, but nothing dramatic seems to happen. You show up, but the results are still small. You try to stay on track, but your life does not transform overnight. And because of that, it is easy to underestimate what consistency is actually doing. The mind looks for visible change. It wants proof, momentum, confirmation that the effort is leading somewhere meaningful. And when that proof does not appear quickly enough, many people begin losing faith in the process itself. That is where discipline becomes essential. Because discipline allows you to continue before the results become emotionally rewarding. It keeps you moving while the change is still subtle, while the progress is still quiet, while the return on your effort is still building beneath the surface in ways you cannot yet fully measure. And that matters because some of the most important things in life do not improve through intensity. They improve through repetition, a better body, a stronger mind, a cleaner work ethic, a more focused life. These things are rarely built in one dramatic burst. They are built through ordinary days that most people would consider too small to matter. A task completed when you did not feel like doing it. A promise kept when no one was watching. A distraction resisted. A routine repeated, a step taken that, on its own, looked unimpressive. That is how compounding begins. Not with a breakthrough, but with continuity. And continuity is exactly what most people struggle to maintain when they live too close to their emotions. They begin strongly, then fade. They commit, then pause. They get inspired, then disappear from the process the moment life feels less convenient. And because of that, they never stay with anything long enough to let it build. Discipline changes that rhythm. It keeps your effort connected across time. Instead of restarting every week from a new burst of intention, you begin carrying the work forward. Instead of relying on occasional motivation to create movement, you create movement that can survive ordinary days. And that is where real progress becomes possible. Because once your actions remain steady enough, they stop existing as isolated efforts. They begin linking together. One day supports the next. One habit strengthens another. One small act of follow-through makes the next one more likely. That is what people mean when they say consistency compounds. It is not just that repeated effort adds up. It is that repeated effort changes the whole system. You become more efficient, more focused, more stable in your routine. The action that once felt difficult to start begins feeling familiar. The identity of someone who shows up starts replacing the identity of someone who keeps beginning and stopping. And because of that, the same effort starts producing more over time than it did at the start. This is one of the reasons disciplined people often look stronger than they feel. Not because they have some special internal certainty all the time, but because they have stayed with the process long enough for the process to start helping them back. Their life begins supporting their progress. Their habits reduce friction. Their environment adjusts. Their self-trust grows. The work stops feeling like a heroic struggle and starts becoming part of the architecture of who they are. That architecture matters because a scattered life drains itself through constant restarting. A disciplined life builds itself through continuation. And over time, the difference between the two becomes enormous, even if it was barely visible at the beginning. Small actions that are repeated do not stay small. They begin shaping outcomes, identity, and momentum in ways that impulsive effort never can. That is why discipline should not be judged by how dramatic it looks in the moment. Its real power is often delayed. You may not feel the impact of one disciplined day, or even one disciplined week. But if those days keep linking together, they begin creating something that occasional effort can never replicate. A life with direction, a mind with rhythm, a body that reflects repeated care, a sense of self built not from promises, but from proof. So maybe the deeper shift is this. You stop asking whether today's action is enough on its own, and start asking what happens when days like this begin stacking on top of each other. Because that is where the real transformation lives. Not in one impressive moment, but in the quiet accumulation of many moments that looked ordinary while they were happening. And the more disciplined you become, the more you begin to trust what repetition can do. Not because it feels exciting every day, but because over time, it becomes undeniable. You gain control over your impulses. There is a quiet force inside every day that shapes more of your life than most people realize. It shows up in small moments, when you reach for distraction instead of continuing, when you choose comfort instead of effort, when you react instead of pausing. These moments don't look important on their own, but they are constant, and over time, they begin forming a pattern, not because you made one big decision, but because you kept choosing what felt easier in the moment. That is how impulses take control, not through something dramatic, but through repetition. An impulse doesn't ask for your long-term goals. It doesn't care about what you said you wanted yesterday. It responds to what feels good now, what feels easy now, what removes discomfort now. And if your actions follow that signal too often, your life begins drifting in a direction you never consciously chose. That is why discipline matters at a deeper level. It gives you a way to interrupt that automatic pattern, not by eliminating impulses, because that's not realistic. They will always be there. The urge to delay, to avoid, to react quickly, to escape discomfort. But discipline changes your relationship with those urges. It creates space between what you feel and what you do. And that space is everything, because without it, your life becomes reactive. You move from one impulse to the next without ever fully choosing your direction. You do what feels right in the moment, even when you know it takes you further from what actually matters. But when discipline begins to take hold, something shifts. You still feel the impulse, but you don't follow it automatically. You notice it, you understand it, and then, instead of letting it decide for you, you choose your response. Sometimes that means continuing when you want to stop. Sometimes it means stopping when you want to indulge. Sometimes it means pausing instead of reacting. And each time you do that, something small but powerful is built. Control. Not control over life, but control over yourself. That control is not loud. It doesn't feel dramatic in the moment, but it changes how you experience everything. Because instead of being carried by your immediate reactions, you begin directing them. Your behavior starts aligning more closely with your long-term intentions, instead of constantly being pulled away by short-term comfort. That alignment creates stability. You become less inconsistent, less scattered, less driven by whatever you happen to feel at the time. And over time, that makes your life more predictable in a positive way. You know how you're going to respond. You know what you're going to choose. Not perfectly, but more often than before. And that builds trust in yourself. Because one of the reasons people feel stuck is not that they lack ability. It's that they can't rely on their own behavior. They set goals, but their impulses keep interfering. They make plans, but their reactions keep redirecting them. And after a while, they stop trusting their own intentions, because those intentions are constantly being overridden. Discipline repairs that. It brings your actions back under your own direction. It shows you that you can feel something and still choose differently. That discomfort does not have to become a command. That an urge does not have to become an action. And once you experience that clearly, your sense of control changes. You're no longer at the mercy of every feeling that passes through you. You become someone who can pause, someone who can decide, someone who can act with intention instead of reaction. That doesn't make life easier in every moment, but it makes your path clearer, because when your impulses stop controlling your behavior starts reflecting who you actually want to become, and that is where real direction begins. Discipline strengthens self-trust. There is a kind of damage that happens quietly when you keep making promises to yourself that your own actions do not honor. No one else may see it. From the outside, life can still look normal. You can still be intelligent, capable, ambitious, even sincere in what you say you want. But if, again and again, you decide something matters and then fail to follow through, something inside you begins to weaken. Not your potential, not your worth. Something more practical than that. Your trust in yourself. And self-trust matters far more than most people realize. Because every meaningful life is built on an invisible relationship between your intentions and your behavior. When you tell yourself you will do something, your mind is listening. When you say tomorrow matters, that this habit matters, that this boundary matters, that this work matters, your system takes note. And if your actions repeatedly contradict those declarations, a quiet fracture begins forming between what you say and what you believe about yourself at a deeper level. That fracture changes everything. You start doubting your own promises before you even make them. You hesitate when setting goals because some part of you no longer fully believes you will stay with them. You want change, but you approach your own intentions with caution because too many of them have dissolved before they became real. Over time, it becomes harder to generate clean confidence, not because you are incapable, but because your inner world has learned that your words are not always followed by action. This is where discipline becomes deeply personal, because discipline does more than improve performance. It repairs the relationship between your word and your life. Every time you do what you said you would do, especially when it is inconvenient, boring, uncomfortable, or emotionally unappealing, you send a very different message inward. You show yourself that your decisions are not just temporary moods, that your standards are not only for ideal days, that your commitments can survive contact with ordinary resistance. That matters. Because self-trust is not built through affirmations, it is built through evidence. Not one dramatic act of discipline, but repeated proof. Small proof. Quiet proof. The kind that accumulates over time. You wake up and do the thing. You keep the promise. You return to the work. You follow through when no one is watching, when the reward is distant, when the emotional excitement is gone. And little by little, a different inner atmosphere begins to form. You stop feeling like someone who merely wants things. You begin feeling like someone who can be counted on, first by yourself. That shift changes the tone of your whole life. You begin making decisions with more steadiness because you trust your ability to carry them. You stop depending so heavily on inspiration because you know you can move without it. You become less fragile around discomfort because you have evidence that discomfort does not automatically stop you. The mind becomes quieter in a certain way because it no longer has to negotiate with the constant suspicion that your intentions may collapse at the first sign of difficulty. And perhaps the most important part is this: once self-trust starts growing, discipline becomes less heavy. Not because the work disappears, but because the inner resistance changes. You are no longer dragging yourself forward through pure force every time. There is something supporting you now, a growing sense that you have done this before, that you do not always abandon yourself, that your future is not entirely at the mercy of your temporary moods. That memory of your own reliability becomes a resource. This is why disciplined people often seem calmer around effort. It is not always that they have more energy or more ideal circumstances. Often it is that they trust themselves more. They do not have to convince themselves from the beginning every single time, because enough evidence has already been collected. Their own history is helping them. Their past follow-through is reducing present friction. And that is a beautiful thing, because so many people are trying to build a better life while quietly carrying an inner relationship full of disappointment. They want more from themselves, but they no longer fully believe themselves when they say it. They are fighting not only procrastination or inconsistency, but a deeper erosion that came from too many broken promises. Discipline begins healing that erosion. So maybe the deeper value of discipline is not only that it helps you achieve more, maybe it is that it helps you become believable to yourself again. The next time you follow through on something difficult, even in a small way, even imperfectly, recognize what is being repaired in that moment. You are not just finishing a task. You are restoring an inner agreement that your life depends on more than you know. Because eventually, confidence is not built from what you hope you are capable of. It is built from the quiet realization that when you tell yourself something matters, more and more often now, you mean it. You reduce procrastination naturally. Procrastination is often misunderstood because people tend to treat it like laziness. They imagine it as a simple refusal to do what needs to be done. But most of the time, procrastination is not that clean. It is more psychological than that. It is avoidance with a reasonable face. A way of stepping away from discomfort without calling it by its real name. You tell yourself you'll do it later. You say you need a clearer head first. You convince yourself that tomorrow will be better, that the timing is just slightly off, that you'll begin properly once you feel more prepared. And because these thoughts sound sensible, procrastination can survive for a very long time without ever feeling like direct self-sabotage. It feels temporary, manageable, even harmless. But what makes procrastination costly is not only the delay, it is what the delay teaches you. Every time you avoid what matters because it feels uncomfortable, a pattern gets reinforced. The mind learns that discomfort means pause, resistance means wait, friction means maybe not now. And over time, this becomes more than a habit. It becomes a way of living, a way in which important things are always slightly postponed, slightly softened, slightly moved to another hour, another day, another version of yourself who will somehow feel more ready than the one who exists right now. That version rarely arrives. This is where discipline begins to change the structure of things in a very practical way. Discipline does not make difficult tasks feel easy. It makes avoidance less automatic. It reduces the amount of conversation you have with resistance. Instead of standing at the edge of action, trying to negotiate yourself into the right mood, you begin moving sooner. Not because you feel no hesitation, but because hesitation no longer has the same authority. And once that happens consistently, procrastination starts weakening on its own, not through forceful self-judgment, not through dramatic self-reinvention, but through repetition. You begin doing the thing closer to when it needs to be done. You begin starting before your mind has fully built the case for delay. You begin learning that action does not actually require the emotional certainty you once thought it did. And the more often you experience that directly, the less convincing procrastination begins to sound. Because much of procrastination survives through imagination. The imagined difficulty of starting, the imagined discomfort of continuing, the imagined need to feel more aligned before taking action. But when discipline becomes stronger, your life contains more evidence that these feelings are rarely as powerful as they seem before you begin. You discover again and again that the dread was heavier than the task, that the resistance was stronger before action than during it, that beginning was the real threshold. That discovery matters. It means procrastination stops feeling like an identity and starts revealing itself as a pattern that can be interrupted, a pattern that loses force every time you move before it has the chance to fully settle over you. This creates an important internal shift. You stop making starting into such a large emotional event. It becomes simpler, less dramatic, less tied to your mood. You no longer need to arrive at the task with the perfect mental posture. You arrive because it is time to arrive. That may sound small, but it changes a great deal. Because once action becomes more normal than delay, the whole architecture of your day begins changing. You spend less energy avoiding, less energy feeling guilty about avoiding, less energy trying to mentally prepare for what would already be easier if you had simply begun. That is one of the hidden burdens of procrastination. It drains you twice. First through the task remaining undone, and then through the mental weight of carrying it while it remains undone. Discipline removes much of that double burden. It turns delayed effort into present movement, and with that, a lot of unnecessary pressure starts dissolving. The beautiful part is that this process becomes self-reinforcing. The more often you act without waiting for ideal conditions, the less frightening action becomes. The less frightening action becomes, the less attractive delay feels. And slowly, Almost without noticing, you find yourself living with less internal drag. Fewer things are hanging over you. Fewer promises are waiting to become real. More of your life is happening in action rather than in postponement. That is not only productive, it is relieving, because there is a deep kind of peace in not constantly carrying the weight of what you should have already started. So maybe the point is not to wage war on procrastination in some dramatic way. Maybe it is to weaken the pattern by strengthening what stands opposite to it. The next time delay begins offering you its usual logic, its usual promises of a better mood, a better hour, a better version of you, you move a little sooner than that voice expects. Not perfectly, not heroically, just enough to remind yourself that discomfort is not a command. Because the more disciplined you become, the less procrastination needs to be fought directly. It begins to lose its place in your life simply because you no longer keep making room for it. Your identity shifts towards strength. Most people think discipline changes what you do, and of course it does. It changes your habits, your routines, your output, the shape of your days. But its deeper effect is not behavioral first, it is personal, because every repeated action eventually becomes evidence. Evidence of what you tolerate, what you avoid, what you return to, what you choose when no one is watching, what you do when comfort and purpose pull in opposite directions. And over time, that evidence starts forming something far more powerful than a routine. It starts forming identity. This is why the issue is never only whether you worked out today, focused today, followed through today, or avoided distraction today. Each of those moments matters beyond itself. Each one quietly answers a deeper question. What kind of person am I becoming through the way I live? That question is always being answered. Not by what you intend, not by what you admire, not even by what you say matters to you, but by what you repeatedly do. If you repeatedly give in to delay, identity begins bending in that direction. If you repeatedly avoid discomfort, a quieter message begins settling inside you. If you repeatedly let mood overrule commitment, some part of you begins seeing weakness not as an occasional lapse, but as the normal pattern of your life. That shift is dangerous, because once weakness becomes familiar, it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like who you are. That is why so many people suffer not only from inconsistency, but from the identity that inconsistency slowly builds. They stop seeing themselves as someone who can be trusted under pressure. They stop believing they are the kind of person who follows through. They speak about change as something they want, but not something that truly belongs to them. The deeper wound is no longer the missed action itself. It is the story being written underneath it. Discipline interrupts that story. Every time you act against resistance, you create different evidence. Every time you do what matters when it would have been easier not to, you are teaching your mind something real. Not in theory, not in self-help language, but in lived proof. You begin showing yourself that you are not only someone who wants strength, you are someone who can act from it. That matters more than motivation ever could, because once identity begins shifting, action changes in a different way. You no longer ask the same questions. You stop circling around whether you feel like it, whether this is a good day, whether you can make an exception this once. The more strength becomes part of how you see yourself, the more certain behaviors start feeling less like decisions and more like alignment. You do them because they fit the kind of person you are becoming, and that is where discipline gets lighter. Not easier in the sense of comfort, but clearer. You begin to understand that every disciplined act is not just helping you achieve something external. It is strengthening the image you carry of yourself. The disciplined day becomes proof. The uncomfortable choice becomes proof. The repeated return becomes proof. And with enough proof, identity starts changing from the inside out. You no longer feel like someone constantly trying to force themselves into better habits. You feel like someone who is becoming harder to bend away from what matters. That shift can be subtle at first. You may only notice it in the way you recover faster after a lapse, or in the way excuses sound thinner than they once did. You may notice that weakness still appears, but it no longer feels as persuasive. The old version of you, the one that used to negotiate endlessly with delay and comfort, begins losing its authority. Not because it vanished, but because it is no longer the only voice you trust. Strength starts having a voice too. Not loud, not theatrical, but steady. A voice that says you have done difficult things before. A voice that does not panic at discomfort. A voice that no longer treats discipline like punishment, but like self-respect in motion. And when that voice grows stronger, your whole life begins organizing around a different center. This is why discipline changes more than habits. It changes the meaning of your own behavior. A hard choice stops being a burden you resent and becomes a reflection of what you stand for. Effort stops feeling like something imposed on you and becomes something chosen by a stronger self that is slowly becoming more familiar. So maybe the real power of discipline is not only that it helps you build a better life. Maybe it is that it stops you from rehearsing weakness as your identity. Because every time you follow through, every time you move despite resistance, every time you choose what matters over what feels easier in the moment, you are doing more than completing a task. You are becoming someone who no longer needs strength to remain an idea. It is starting to become your nature. Discipline simplifies decision-making. A large part of mental fatigue does not come from doing too much. It comes from deciding too much. What should I do now? Should I start or wait? Is this the right time? Do I feel ready enough? These questions repeat themselves throughout the day, often in small, almost invisible ways, and each time you pause to negotiate with yourself, something is being spent. Attention, energy, clarity. You may not notice it immediately, but by the end of the day your mind feels heavier, not because of what you've done, but because of how much you've had to think about doing it. That is what an undisciplined system creates. Too many open decisions. Too many moments where action depends on how you feel, what you prefer, or what seems easiest right now. And when every action requires a new internal negotiation, life becomes slower, heavier, and more uncertain than it needs to be. This is where discipline quietly changes everything. Because discipline reduces the number of decisions you have to make, it turns certain actions into defaults. You no longer ask whether you will do the thing. You ask when you will do it. You no longer debate whether it's necessary. You've already decided that it is. The conversation that used to happen before every action begins to disappear because the outcome is no longer up for negotiation. That removes a surprising amount of mental friction. You wake up and move, not because you feel perfect, but because that's what you do now. You sit down to work without building a long emotional case for it. You follow through without needing to redecide your commitment every time resistance appears. And over time, this creates a rhythm that feels much lighter than constant deliberation. Because fewer decisions mean more energy. Your mind is not constantly switching between options. It is not repeatedly evaluating whether to act. It is not burning energy trying to convince itself. It is simply moving forward along a path that has already been chosen. This is one of the reasons disciplined people often seem calmer. It is not that their lives are easier. It is that their internal dialogue is quieter. They are not spending the same amount of time debating themselves. They are not getting pulled into the same level of hesitation before each action. Much of what they do has already been decided at a higher level through values, standards, and commitments that no longer need to be questioned every hour. That clarity simplifies everything. You know what matters. You know what you do. You know what you don't negotiate. And because of that, your days begin to feel more structured without feeling forced. There is less randomness in your behavior, less drift, less wasted time standing between intention and action. This does not mean your life becomes rigid. It means your priorities become stable. And that stability creates freedom in an unexpected way. Because when the important decisions are already made, your mind has more space for everything else. Creativity improves. Focus deepens. Your attention is not constantly being consumed by basic questions of whether you should act. That layer of noise disappears, and what remains is a clearer, more direct path through your day. There is also something else that begins to change. You stop trusting momentary feelings as decision makers. You begin trusting your prior clarity. The version of you who decided what matters, who set the direction, who understood the long-term value of your actions, starts guiding the version of you who is tired, distracted, or resistant in the moment. And that alignment between past clarity and present action creates a much stronger system than relying on current mood. So maybe the shift here is not about trying to think better in every moment. Maybe it is about deciding better ahead of time. Because the more your life depends on real-time decision-making, the more vulnerable it becomes to fluctuation. But the more it rests on clear, disciplined commitments, the less each moment has the power to pull you away from your path. And once that structure is in place, something becomes noticeably easier. Not the work itself, but the act of beginning it. Because you are no longer asking yourself if you will, you already know. You build long-term stability. A lot of people spend years trying to change their life without ever becoming stable enough to hold the change. They begin something, then stop. They improve for a while, then drift. They create momentum, then lose it the moment life becomes inconvenient again. And because of that pattern, even real effort starts feeling temporary. Progress comes in waves, not in structure. They have intense periods, productive periods, hopeful periods, but not enough continuity for those periods to become a reliable life. That is what discipline begins to change, not only your behavior in the moment, but the overall stability of how your life is built. Because long-term stability is not created through occasional intensity. It is created through repeatability, through actions you can continue, through standards that remain when motivation drops, through routines that survive ordinary stress. A stable life is not one that looks impressive for a week. It is one that can carry itself through months and years without constantly collapsing back into chaos. And that kind of stability matters more than people realize. Without it, everything becomes more fragile than it needs to be. Your health depends too much on mood. Your work depends too much on inspiration. Your peace depends too much on circumstances staying favorable. So even if you care deeply, even if you genuinely want more from yourself, your life keeps slipping because there is no strong enough structure underneath your intentions to hold them in place. Discipline becomes that structure. It turns good intentions into repeatable behavior. It gives your goals something to stand on besides hope. It creates patterns that remain even when your emotional state changes, and over time, that does something profoundly calming to the inner life. You stop feeling like you are always starting over. You stop living in constant recovery from your own inconsistency. You begin feeling that your life has some backbone to it. That backbone changes how you experience time. The future stops feeling so uncertain because your present is no longer random. You know what your days tend to look like. You know what you return to. You know what supports you when things feel scattered. That does not mean every day becomes perfect, but it means your life is no longer being built on impulses and exceptions alone. It begins resting on something steadier. That steadiness creates a different kind of confidence. Not the loud kind that comes from temporary success, but the quieter kind that comes from knowing your life is no longer entirely vulnerable to your moods. You begin trusting the system you have built. The habits, the boundaries, the routines, the standards. You know that even if a difficult day comes, there is something stable waiting for you on the other side of it. Something you can return to instead of having to rebuild from nothing. This is one of the deepest forms of relief discipline can give. Because instability is exhausting. It makes every setback feel larger, every interruption feel more threatening, every lapse feel like the beginning of another collapse. But when discipline has created enough structure in your life, one bad day does not erase everything. One emotional dip does not dismantle the foundation. There is enough continuity in place that you can recover without feeling like you lost the whole path. That is long-term stability, not perfection, not rigidity, but a life that can keep its shape under pressure. And the truth is, most people want this far more than they want intensity. They want to know that what they are building will last, that their peace will not disappear every time life becomes difficult, that their progress will not always depend on temporary emotion, that the person they are trying to become will not keep vanishing every few weeks because nothing strong enough exists to support that identity yet. Discipline is what creates that support. So maybe the real value of discipline is not only that it helps you perform better today, maybe it is that it gives your life a more durable form, a way of living that does not keep breaking every time comfort becomes tempting or pressure becomes inconvenient. A way of carrying yourself that remains recognizable even when the external conditions are not ideal. Because in the end, a stable life is not built by wanting better things once in a while. It is built by becoming steady enough to keep choosing them long after the feeling that started you has faded. You stop negotiating with weakness. There is a conversation that happens quietly inside almost every undisciplined life. It is not always obvious, and it rarely sounds dramatic. Most of the time it sounds reasonable, gentle, temporary, harmless. You can do it later. One more day won't matter. You've already done enough. You'll start properly tomorrow. And because the voice sounds so ordinary, most people do not realize what they are really participating in. They think they are making small decisions. In reality, they are training a pattern where every moment of resistance becomes an invitation to bargain with their own lower impulses. That is what weakness often looks like in practice. Not failure in some grand sense, but repeated negotiation with what is easiest. A slow habit of giving your future away in exchange for present comfort. The body wants ease, the mind wants relief, the emotions want softness, and instead of holding the line, you begin discussing terms with the very part of you that has already proven it cannot be trusted to lead. That discussion is expensive, because every time weakness is allowed to negotiate, it gains more credibility. It starts sounding wise, it starts sounding compassionate, it starts sounding like self-care, realism, flexibility, balance. And of course, there are moments where rest is wisdom, where softness is necessary, where stopping is right. But that is not what this is about. This is about the part of you that knows exactly what matters, and still keeps looking for permission to avoid it. Discipline changes that relationship. It removes the open door. You stop treating every moment of resistance as something that deserves a conversation. You stop acting as if discomfort automatically creates the right to delay. You stop asking weakness what it thinks should happen next. Not because you become cruel with yourself, but because you begin to understand something simple and deeply important. The part of you that wants the easier path in the moment is not always the part that wants your life to become stronger. That realization changes the entire emotional posture of your days. You begin to see hesitation differently. Fatigue, distraction, laziness, avoidance, the urge to postpone, the urge to soften your own standards just enough to escape what feels hard right now. These things stop feeling like trustworthy guidance. They become what they often were all along, temporary states, not decision makers. Present, yes. Loud sometimes, yes. But no longer automatically invited to shape your actions. And that is where real strength starts becoming visible. Not when difficulty disappears, but when your relationship to difficulty changes. When you stop saying, "Let me see if I can make myself do it," and start saying, "This is what happens next." When the task does not need to win an emotional debate before it is allowed to begin, when your standards stop, depending on whether weakness is in the mood to cooperate, that shift can feel severe at first, especially if you're used to living in constant internal negotiation. But after a while, it becomes cleaner than severity. It becomes peace. Because one of the most exhausting things in life is not effort itself. It is the endless discussion before effort, the constant bargaining, the repeated softening, the way your own mind learns that any hard thing can be delayed if it creates enough emotional resistance. Discipline ends that discussion earlier, and when it does, life becomes simpler. You waste less energy persuading yourself. You spend less time circling around what needs to be done. You stop feeding the fantasy that there will always be a more comfortable hour, a more ideal mood, a better version of you waiting in the future to take over. You work with the self that exists now, and in doing that, you begin building a life with much more honesty in it. Because the truth is, weakness rarely disappears before action. It usually gets quieter after action begins. That is why negotiating with it is such a trap. You are giving too much authority to a voice that often loses much of its power the moment you move. The resistance felt enormous before you started, and strangely smaller once you were inside the task. The urge to avoid seemed persuasive until momentum replaced it. This happens so often that eventually you begin recognizing weakness not as truth, but as the final test before alignment. So maybe the deeper value of discipline here is not that it makes you tougher in a theatrical sense. It is that it teaches you where not to keep talking. Not every feeling deserves deliberation. Not every urge deserves consideration. Not every desire for ease deserves a seat at the table. Some parts of you need understanding, and some parts of you need to stop being obeyed. Because a strong life is not built by winning one giant battle against weakness. It is built by quietly ending thousands of small negotiations with it before they shape the direction of who you become. Discipline builds confidence through action. Confidence is often misunderstood as something that appears before action. People wait to feel ready. They wait to feel certain. They wait to feel like the kind of person who can do what they are about to attempt. And when that feeling doesn't arrive, they hesitate. They delay. They question themselves. They assume that the absence of confidence means the timing is wrong, or that they need more preparation, more clarity, more internal assurance before they begin. But confidence rarely works that way. It is not something that appears fully formed in the mind and then gets expressed in action. It is something that is built through action, and discipline is what makes that possible, because discipline allows you to act before confidence exists. It lets you move when you are still uncertain, when you still doubt yourself, when you are not fully sure how things will go, and at first that can feel uncomfortable because you are stepping into something without the emotional safety that confidence seems to promise. But this is where the process begins. You take action once, and it feels imperfect. You take action again, and it still feels uncertain. You continue, not because you feel strong yet, but because you have decided to keep moving regardless of how you feel. And with each repetition, something starts changing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. You begin collecting evidence. Evidence that you can act despite hesitation. Evidence that you can handle more than you expected. Evidence that your fear was not entirely accurate. And that evidence begins reshaping how you see yourself. Confidence grows from that. Not from thinking about what you might be capable of, but from experiencing what you have already done. It becomes less about belief and more about memory. You remember that you showed up, that you followed through, that you stayed when it would have been easier to leave. And those memories begin supporting you the next time you face something difficult. This is why disciplined people often seem more confident, not because they started that way, but because they have built a history of action. They are not relying on hope, they are relying on proof. And that proof makes their confidence more stable, because it is grounded in reality rather than imagination. There is also something else that begins to shift. You stop needing to feel perfect before you begin. You stop treating hesitation as a signal to wait. You understand that discomfort is part of the process, not a sign that something is wrong. And because of that, you move more freely. Not recklessly, but without the same level of internal resistance that once held you back. That freedom changes how you experience challenges. They stop feeling like threats to your identity and start feeling like opportunities to expand it. Each action becomes a chance to reinforce who you are becoming. Each effort becomes part of a larger pattern that is slowly building something stronger inside you. And over time, confidence becomes quieter, less dependent on how you feel in the moment, less shaken by small setbacks, less tied to immediate success or failure. It becomes something steadier, something that comes from knowing you can rely on yourself to act, even when the outcome is uncertain. That kind of confidence is durable, because it doesn't collapse the moment things go wrong. It adjusts, it continues, it remains connected to the process rather than being attached to a single result. So maybe the shift here is not about trying to feel more confident before you begin. Maybe it is about building confidence the only way it actually grows. Through action, through repetition, through showing yourself again and again that you are capable of moving forward even when you are not fully sure. Because the more disciplined your actions become, the less you need confidence to start, and the more confidence begins to follow you as a result of what you've already done. You become reliable to yourself first. There is a difference between wanting a better life and becoming someone who can actually carry one. A lot of people want meaningful change. They want discipline, stability, progress, peace, strength. They imagine a version of themselves who is clearer, more focused, more dependable, more in control. But wanting that version of yourself is not the same as becoming trustworthy enough to build a life around. That trust is where everything starts. Because the most important relationship your future depends on is not only the one you have with work, goals, or opportunity. It is the one you have with your own follow-through. Can your future depend on your present self to act in ways that support it? Can your deeper values depend on your ordinary behavior? Can the promises you make in a moment of clarity survive the moods that come after? For many people, the answer is unstable, not because they are weak in some permanent sense, but because their patterns have taught them inconsistency. They mean what they say in the moment. They genuinely care. They sincerely want change. But when the time comes to act, too much depends on mood, energy, convenience, and emotional willingness. And over time, that creates a painful split. The person inside you who longs for more keeps getting handed over to the person inside you who keeps postponing it. That is why discipline matters in such a deep way. It makes you reliable, not only to the world, but to yourself, and that is where real stability begins. Because once you become someone who follows through more often than you retreat, something changes in the way you live. You stop feeling like your own life is built on uncertain ground. You stop depending on temporary bursts of motivation to carry important things. You stop approaching your goals as if they belong to a version of you who only exists on good days. Instead, your life begins resting on something more solid. You become the kind of person who can be counted on by your own deeper self. That reliability is quietly transformative. It changes how you speak to yourself because your mind starts believing you more. It changes how you plan because your plans are no longer made in a vacuum, disconnected from your actual behavior. It changes how you face difficulty because you are not starting from zero every time resistance appears. There is already a pattern in place, a history, a growing body of proof that says, when something matters, I return to it, and that proof creates a kind of peace. Not because discipline removes effort, but because it removes so much uncertainty. You no longer have to wonder every day which version of you will show up. You no longer have to constantly rebuild trust after breaking your own word. You no longer have to keep carrying the disappointment that comes from knowing you are capable of more while repeatedly acting below it. That disappointment is heavier than many people admit, because nothing drains the spirit like repeatedly witnessing your own potential and then watching yourself fail to protect it. Not once, but often enough that you begin lowering your expectations simply to avoid the pain of another broken promise. Discipline begins reversing that, slowly, quietly, but powerfully. You start becoming someone who can carry your own intentions into reality, someone who can hold the line when discomfort appears, someone who does not always need ideal conditions in order to remain aligned with what matters. And once that becomes part of how you live, your whole relationship with yourself becomes more settled. You feel less divided, less scattered between the self that wants more and the self that keeps sabotaging it. You begin feeling that these two selves are finally starting to cooperate. That is what reliability gives you, a life with less internal contradiction. And from there, so many other things become possible: better work, better health, better boundaries, better decisions, better use of your time. Not because discipline magically creates success, but because it creates something. Success depends on more than most people realize. A self that can be trusted to keep showing up long after the emotional excitement has passed. So maybe this is the deepest reason staying disciplined matters. Not because it makes you impressive, not because it makes you look strong, but because it makes you someone your own life can lean on, and that may be one of the most important forms of strength a person can ever build. Discipline gives you freedom, not restriction. One of the biggest misunderstandings about discipline is that people imagine it as a kind of prison, a life of pressure, denial, control, and constant force. They look at discipline and see limitation, less spontaneity, less comfort, less room to follow what they feel in the moment. And because of that, they often resist the very thing that could make their life lighter. But the truth is almost the opposite. A lack of discipline does not create freedom. It creates dependency. It makes you dependent on motivation, dependent on mood, dependent on ideal timing, dependent on whether the day feels easy enough to do what matters. And that is not freedom. That is a life constantly being handed over to conditions that change every few hours. Real freedom begins when your life is no longer controlled by those shifts. That is what discipline gives you. It removes the need to ask your feelings for permission before you move. It frees your future from being repeatedly sabotaged by what is comfortable in the present. It allows you to build a life that is not constantly collapsing under impulse, distraction, avoidance, and delay. At first, that can feel restrictive because discipline asks something from you. It asks for structure, repetition, restraint, the willingness to keep doing what matters when the emotional reward is low. But if you stay with it long enough, you begin to notice that what felt like restriction was actually release. You are released from indecision, released from constant postponement, released from the guilt of knowing what matters and not doing it, released from the exhausting cycle of starting, stopping, regretting, and starting again. That kind of release is not always dramatic, but it changes daily life in very real ways. Your mornings feel clearer because you are not constantly negotiating with yourself. Your attention becomes more available because it is not being drained by procrastination and mental avoidance. Your goals feel more reachable because they are no longer trapped behind the question of whether you feel like showing up. You begin to understand that discipline does not reduce your life. It organizes it around what you actually want. And that creates a deeper kind of freedom than impulsive living ever could. Because impulsive living feels free only in the immediate sense. You can do whatever feels easiest, softest, most comforting right now. But over time, that way of living narrows your life. It weakens your options. It creates instability. It leaves you less prepared, less focused, less capable of carrying the things you say matter most. In the short term, it feels open. In the long term, it becomes a cage built out of your own undirected habits. Discipline breaks that cage. It gives you access to a life that is less ruled by chaos and more shaped by intention. It allows you to choose the direction of your days instead of being carried by whatever urge arrives first. And that is why so many disciplined people begin experiencing something unexpected after a while. They feel lighter, not heavier. Not because the work vanished, but because so much friction vanished with it. So much confusion, so much guilt, so much hidden self-disappointment, so much of the private exhaustion that comes from living without structure. So maybe the real question is not whether discipline limits you. Maybe the real question is what your lack of discipline has already been costing you. Because once you see clearly how much energy, peace, and possibility are lost to inconsistency, distraction, and inner negotiation, discipline stops looking like control for its own sake. It starts looking like a way back into your own life. And that is why, in the deepest sense, discipline is not a cage. It is often the first real form of freedom a person ever builds for themselves. Discipline makes life less intimidating. A lot of people are not only tired, they are intimidated, not always by something dramatic, but by life itself. By the pile of unfinished things, by the responsibilities they keep postponing, by the goals that have started feeling too far away, by the pressure of knowing they should be handling more than they currently are. And because that pressure keeps building while action keeps being delayed, life starts feeling bigger, heavier, and more threatening than it actually is. This is one of the hidden consequences of living without discipline. Things grow in your mind because you keep meeting them too late. Tasks become overwhelming because they were avoided too long. Conversations become frightening because they were postponed until tension built around them. Goals become intimidating because they were admired from a distance instead of entered through daily action. Even ordinary responsibilities start carrying emotional weight because they are no longer just things to do. They become symbols of everything you have not yet faced. That is where life starts feeling heavier than it is. Not because everything is truly impossible, but because your relationship with action has become weak enough that reality keeps arriving faster than your willingness to meet it. Discipline changes that. It makes life less intimidating because it changes how you meet what is in front of you. You stop waiting until things become emotionally large before acting. You stop giving avoidance enough time to turn manageable things into mental mountains. You begin addressing life in smaller, steadier pieces, and because of that, fewer things have the chance to become terrifying in your imagination. That shift matters more than most people realize. Because much of what people call fear is not always fear of the thing itself. Often it is fear built from delay. Fear made larger by distance. Fear fed by repetition of not acting. The longer something sits untouched, the more power it gains in your mind. The more you avoid it, the less capable you feel in relation to it. And after a while, what might have been difficult but possible begins feeling enormous. Discipline interrupts that process early. It teaches you to move before your mind has the chance to enlarge everything, to enter the task, the conversation, the challenge, the responsibility, while it is still real and not yet mythologized by avoidance. And over time, that changes your nervous system in a profound way. You begin learning that many things are less frightening in action than they were in imagination. That realization builds courage, but not the theatrical kind. A quieter kind, the kind that comes from familiarity with effort, familiarity with discomfort, familiarity with beginning before you feel emotionally prepared. Life becomes less intimidating when you stop treating every hard thing like a rare emergency and start meeting difficulty often enough that it loses some of its power to shock you. This does not mean life becomes easy. It means you become less easily overpowered by it. You trust yourself more when new demands appear. You recover faster when pressure enters the day. You stop looking at the future as if it is one giant force waiting to overwhelm you. Instead, you begin seeing it as something that can be met the same way discipline has taught you to meet everything else. One decision, one action, one honest step at a time. That makes the whole experience of living feel different. Less like something looming over you. Less like something you are already behind in. Less like a test you are destined to fail the moment it becomes hard. And in its place, something steadier begins to form, a sense that life can be faced, not perfectly, not without fear, but without constantly shrinking before it. So maybe one of the deepest gifts of discipline is not only that it helps you build more, it helps you fear less. Because the more often you prove to yourself that you can meet what is difficult, the less life has to rely on intimidation to control you. And eventually, what once felt overwhelming begins to feel like something else entirely. Something real, something manageable, something that no longer has to tower over you simply because you delayed stepping toward it. The real power of discipline is not that it turns you into a machine. It turns you into someone who no longer needs to be rescued by motivation every time life asks something difficult of you. That is a very different kind of strength. A strength that shows up in ordinary moments, in getting up when you would rather stay down, in beginning when your mind wants to delay, in following through when the reward is still far away, in choosing what matters often enough that, over time, your life begins reflecting those choices instead of just your intentions. And that is what changes everything. Because discipline is not only about tasks, routines, or productivity, it is about identity. It is about whether your life is being shaped by what you say matters or by what feels easiest in the moment. It is about whether the future can trust the person you are being today. It is about whether your own word still has weight inside your own mind. Once discipline begins to grow, a great deal of confusion starts falling away. You stop waiting to feel ready. You stop restarting your life every few weeks. You stop negotiating with every impulse that asks for comfort at the cost of direction. And little by little, something steadier begins to take form. Your actions become more reliable. Your self-trust becomes stronger. Your life gains structure that does not collapse every time your mood changes. That steadiness is not glamorous. It is not loud. It is not the kind of thing the world always celebrates in the moment. But it is one of the few things that can quietly transform everything over time. Because once you become disciplined, your life stops depending so heavily on chance. It begins depending more on character. And that may be the deepest gift discipline gives you. Not a perfect life, but a stronger self. One your future can finally begin building on.